Thank you, everyone, for coming. First of all, I'm shocked at the number of people who are interested in art Bibles. I figured this was going to be a small talk, but apparently there's a lot of people who are into it too, which is great because I've always found it really fascinating, the idea of getting, all of distilling an entire, whether it's a project or an IP, into a set of rules that both instead of stifles creativity, helps creativity. And so this talk is for you. So just to mention, there's going to be two parts to the talk. So the first part is going to be theory and workflow, which is going to be mostly text. And then the second part is going to be the practical example, where I'm going to go through an art Bible, and that'll be mostly images. So if in the first 20 minutes of the talk you're like, where are the images? They're coming, so don't worry about it. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Neil Blevins. I'm an art director and senior concept artist for film, games, books, and tech. And I've also done a bunch of other jobs during my career. I've done digital matte paint, I've done effects animation, I've done modeling and texturing sets and props and that sort of thing. And I grew up in the wilderness, frozen wilderness of Canada. And this is a shot from outside of my house. And when I was very, very young, I was about 3, my dad was fixing the fence beside our house. And I was so small, it was raining, and there was an umbrella sitting on the ground, and I was so small I could sit under the umbrella. And what happened was I took a board, and I took a hammer, and I took a screwdriver as a chisel, and I chiseled a completely detailed snow walker from Empire Strikes Back into this board, including all the greebles and details. You can see all this stuff in the side. And it kind of freaked my parents out. But it was, I was destined to be an artist and doing this kind of stuff, I think, very much from the beginning. It was not a choice. It was just sort of me and who I was. And then here's a slightly more detailed drawing. I think it was about a year later. So I loved the snow walkers. They were just fantastic, these big elephant-like machines that were walking around. And just Star Wars in general, as a lot of people my age, that was our #1 touchstone. So since then, I've managed to work on quite a number of awesome films. I was very lucky to work at Pixar for 16 years. As well as films, I also worked on a bunch of video games. A bunch of these were very early in my career, and then a few now more later in my career. And I've also done a bunch of books. And so some of the top ones are books that I've added to in terms of their compilation books of artwork. And then I have 3 of my own books down at the bottom, which I'll just super quick go through. So the first is The Story of Ink, which is a narrative art book. And that's the one that we're going to be talking about mostly during this Art Bible talk. Then there was Megastructures, which is a visual encyclopedia of enormous structures like O'Neill cylinders and Dyson spheres and that sort of thing. By the way, both Ink and this book they were collaborative books. So while I was sort of the head of the book, the first one, there was a big team. And then the second one here, I had a bunch of people help me out do guest spots in the book itself. And then most recently, I've just done a real simple sketchbook. I really got into Inktober a number of years back and loved drawing little spaceships, and so decided to do this, along with a little blurb about sketching and whatnot. But anyway, that's a little bit about me, but let's get to the topic at hand. And first, a few definitions. So an entertainment IP, which stands for intellectual property. So it's a universe that is explored in a number of projects, usually in many mediums, such as film, animation, games, toys, books, etc. And this is also sometimes referred to as a franchise. Although franchise, I feel, is pushing it a little more in the direction of how do we make money, which of course is vital if you're going to make these big projects. But at the same time, I do prefer the art side of things a little bit more. And then an art Bible. So an art Bible, it's a document that, if done right, can be read by anyone on a particular project, and then they'll be able to produce a piece of artwork that fits into the project's aesthetic. So it's a recipe, it's a formula, it's a guide, it's a rule set which shows the style of the project through text and images. And over the years, I've made several art Bibles for smaller projects, and I've contributed to art Bibles for some major projects. And I've also had the privilege of watching some of the best art directors in film and video games make theirs. So this lesson will be my take on world building and defining a fictional universe using an art Bible. So one little note before we start. So art Bible versus style guide. So a lot of people use this word interchangeably. That's totally fine. You can use it interchangeably. Personally, I define it a little different. So I think of an art Bible as for an entire IP, whereas a style guide is more specific to a project that's part of that IP and frequently refers to something that's a little bit more stylized. So for example, all the Star Wars projects have certain aesthetic choices that bind them together, but you want a separate set of style guides to show, for example, what the Clone Wars look like, the Star Wars cartoon, versus, say, the Star Wars live-action film. And this is just an example of a style guide that I love. There was this film called The Secret of Kells. If you've never seen this, it's spectacular. And the art book basically the art book is the style guide for the film in many ways. So if you don't get, I think this is still on sale. Go check it out. It's fantastic. So that's a little bit more what I would consider a style guide. But again, people have different opinions, totally fine. So creating a pocket universe. So whether you're writing a book, making a movie, or creating a video game, you're creating this little pocket universe which is attached to our own. And so these were the pocket universes that I grew up with the most. So Star Wars, the Transformers, Lord of the Rings, a lot of sci-fi, a lot of fantasy. And basically every single day I would trade a few hours of time in our universe, even though our universe is pretty cool, but for one of these created universes. And then later in life at companies like Pixar, I got a chance to help create alternate universes for others to enjoy, which was incredibly rewarding. And so what you're trying to do is, making a coherent world with a huge team of people that all have their own opinions about stuff is really difficult to do. And it's not about whether their idea is better or your idea is better. Hopefully people are choosing the best idea out there. But it's about how do you keep everyone on the same page. And so there needs to be some sort of fixed point, a place where you can always go to and know the current direction of the project. And for the art department, that's the art Bible. That's that fixed point. And it should be loose enough to give an artist a chance to bring their own experience to the table. Again, it shouldn't be so tight that you're just turning people into wrists, basically. But at the same time, it has to be detailed enough that you don't get a bunch of random disconnected artwork that looks like it's from a zillion different IPs. Consistency is very important. And you also need to help in there define the visual hook, if not the visual hook for your whole IP, for a subpart of your IP. And so you might ask, what's a visual hook? And so a visual hook is something that makes something distinct from other things. So like this is a real simple example. If you look at, in Star Wars, the Rebel fleet. The Rebel fleet ships always look like they're mashed with all these different parts. Like there's very few that look the same to each other. And the reason is because they're the Rebel fleet. They don't have like a big manufacturing plant to create Rebel ships. Because if they did that, the Empire would come in and kill them all, right? So they're taking random ships from here and there and putting them together, or whatever they can get in order to fight the war that they're doing. And so that cobbled together part, it connects a part of the universe and the story of that universe to a visual result. And that's the visual hook for what it is that, for example, the Rebels are doing inside of Star Wars. Other visual hooks, you have, at Star Wars, basically every planet is its own theme. You have the ice planet, you have the forest planet, you have the desert planet. And that's a way you always know where you are and what planet you are if you do a good job of defining sort of what that particular planet looks like. This is from the video game Destiny. So they have all these alien races that you're fighting against. And here we have, on the left, the Cabal, which are these sort of big, bulky creatures. Then you have the Fallen, which have 4 arms. And then you have the Hive that look basically like zombies. And then you have the Vex, which are these gold-plated things with 1 eye that are almost like robotic-like. And the cool thing about this is they are very distinct from each other. They each have their own visual hook. So if I show you this and you look at these 3 characters, 2 different styles of characters, you immediately go, these are Vex. Because I know they have that gold-plated and they got the 1 eye. And so achieving something that gives that very distinctive look is very important. And that's something an art Bible can help with. For example, you're doing a robot IP. So here's the Bayformers, and then here's 5-Star Stories, and here's the Zoids. These are all basically robot IPs, but they look very different from each other. If you had to say something about the Bayformers, it's that they're just, a tremendous amount of visual detail. Perhaps too much visual detail, but that's a story for a different time. 5-Star Stories, big robots again, but these robots, they all look like medieval knights. They have that, they got the really thin waist, the really big hips, they have shields, swords, axes, that sort of thing. And the Zoids, they all are sort of based on dinosaurs, and they all have these little, funny little pegs on them and stuff like that. So again, a way of creating something that looks very different from something else, so when you see something, you immediately go, I know what that is. Like, not in this sort of vein, but Minecraft. If you see a character in Minecraft, you instantly know that's Minecraft. And so that's sort of the thing that you're going for. Now, as far as what I'm going to be showing today, I know you'd all love me to show you the art Bible for Up or the art Bible for Wall-E or something like that, but due to NDAs and lawyers, et cetera, I cannot show you any professional art Bible of the projects that I've worked on. So sorry if you're here for that. We're going to be looking at one of my projects, which is the Story of Ink, which I have complete control over showing you the art Bible of because it belongs to me. So a little story about the story of ink. So the story of ink, again, is a narrative art book. So the idea is it's a mixture of a full script, almost like a film, and then paintings of all the key moments in the book. We sold it on Kickstarter, and it did well, and it shipped out to a whole bunch of people. It was created by a team of 12 people. Here's the 12 people. You might notice there's a dog in the bottom. That's because my friend Nathan didn't get me a picture in time. So I told him, if you don't get me a picture in time, I'm putting a picture of your dog there. And then he didn't get me the picture in time. So that is Nemo, who sadly has passed away since the book. But very cute dog, very lovable. And so doing this project, even though it was a book project, I decided to run it like a film project. So I was the director of the project. And then beside me, you see in this picture, Bill Zahn and Stefan Bugaj. And so the three of us were the writer's room, basically, that wrote the story. I'm pretty good at coming up with ideas, but I'm horrible at writing dialogue and that stuff. And the key was, like, all these people brought something unique to the project, which I couldn't have done alone. Or I could have done alone, but it would have taken me 100 years. And then, it would have never come out. But we had a writer's room, we had concept artists, we had finished illustrators. So some people, for example, made concept art that actually was just for creating the IP. Other people were making concept art that ended in the book itself as illustrations. And so some people were making 3D artwork, some people were doing 2D painting, and a lot of that artwork is what you're going to be seeing in this particular talk. So first of all, the lesson is more about formatting, not coming up with the ideas. I'll explain a little bit about the ideas for the ink IP in here, but really it's more about how I formatted the art Bible that I hope that you take from this. This is the art Bible for world building, not story. An example would be Star Wars versus The Empire Strikes Back. I'm not going to be talking about specifics about the story. That said, there are some mild spoilers for ink, so if you want to get the book is sold out, but if you want to get the electronic copy, mild spoilers, nothing big. It'll probably be fine. 95% of the work was done almost a decade ago, which is kind of crazy, but it's sort of the case, so just mentioning. And then also, I'll only be covering the planet and the people of the Oasis. So there's kind of 3 different groups in the story of ink. There's the desert planet, which is what we're going to be going through. But then there's also the aliens, which has its own aesthetic, and a whole group of people who worked on ink worked on that stuff. And then there's also the space pirates, which is yet another aesthetic. So I'm very sorry for the people who worked on this project, whose work will not be featured in this talk, but doing the same thing for all 3 groups seems kind of redundant. So we're going to do one, and that should give you what you need to know. Okay, final bit of talking before we start getting into some art. So the concept pipeline. So everyone has a different way of going about doing this concept pipeline. Depends on your art director or your production designer if you're doing movies. The way I've done it frequently and the way I personally prefer doing it myself is sort of 5 steps. So you got the story, then reference gathering, blue sky concept art, making the art Bible, and then detailed concept art and art Bible revisions. So as a Pixar alumni, story is king. That's not just BS that's out there. At Pixar, every decision you make has to relate to the story. And that rubbed off on me in my personal projects, and I think that it's a really good rule to live by. Now, that doesn't mean the story is going to be 100% finished before you start making the art. And there'll be some examples in here showing sort of that back and forth. But at the end of the day, the story is the most important part. So then reference, gathering a ton of reference. And some of that can be other video games and films or other artist work. But personally, I try as much as possible to focus on real-world reference because you want to ground the audience in a recognizable style, but without copying games and films that people have already played before. And that's tough if you only, like I had this one guy who was not the best art director, and he was all about, make it look like Game of Thrones. No, make it look like this, make it look like that. And everything came out derivative. And he's like, why does this look all derivative? I'm like, it's because we should be looking at the real world. And he goes, no, that's not it. I left that project. Then blue sky concept art. So this is where the concept team gets to make artwork based on the reference and the story without worrying too much about consistency or getting everything right the first time. So this is about exploring and experimentation. Make as much artwork as possible, make mistakes, leave no stone unturned, and eventually some stylistic elements will start to emerge that speaks to the team. So then there's the Art Bible stage. And so from the blue sky phase, some consistent themes, visual language will emerge. And now it's time to codify those into a single consistent set of rules. And at first, the Art Bible is likely to be a mix of both the reference material that you collected at the beginning and blue sky concept. But as more concept gets created, your goal should be to replace as much of the real-world reference material in there as possible with final paintings. But the Art Bible at the beginning is going to probably be mostly reference and then a few paintings here and there. And that's not a bad thing. It's just you got to remember to replace it as you go. And then the detailed concept phase is once the concept team starts making the artwork for all the specific characters, worlds, vehicles, props, etc., which is based on the art Bible, you'll get more and more material that you can replace more and more of the art Bible with, which is what you're headed for. And just a note, an art Bible is a living document. So it'd be great if the art Bible were completed and never revised, and then you just go with it, right? That never happens. I've never worked on a project where that has happened. It's always being revised. A script changes. The video game, the feature changes, which requires a change to the style, et cetera, et cetera. So the goal here is to keep it updated as you go and keep it as current as possible. It's meant to be the best snapshot of the project at a given moment in time. But again, don't worry about it being done because it'll be done when the project is done, probably. So let's go for it. The Story of Ink Art Bible. Again, this is based on notes by myself, Bill Zahn, and Stefan Bugaj, who did the original story. And this is the first page of the art Bible for this particular group, which you saw a little bit earlier. So this one, I just put like a big sort of hero image. This one's by artist Chris Stosky. I really liked this particular image that he came up with. And then there's the 3 pillars. So you might ask what pillars are. So pillars are basically the most important things that if you follow these things, everything else can kind of derive from it. And so for this particular group in the story, the 3 pillars were the desert, high-tech scrap, and epic scale. And to some extent, everything you're going to see in the art Bible represents these 3 big pillars. And one thing I want to mention about pillars, be specific as possible. So for example, I had this other art director who was not the greatest, and like some of their pillars were strength or integrity, right? And like those pillars, like how do you use that? Strength means different things to different people. Integrity means different things to different people. It's not specific enough. And I know that they were maybe trying to be artsy or trying to, but it's just, it doesn't work. In general, I believe that pillars should be, maybe these are too specific, like brushed metal or delicate lace clothing, but they are at least actionable. You can go ahead and you can do what you need to do with that kind of information if you get the art Bible. And a great example, another example I wanted to give you, I once, one of my office mates was one of the producers on the new Doom video game, well, newish. It was Doom 4, which they just called Doom again, but it was, I think, like 4 or 5 years back. And he told me that when they were working on the game, and this wasn't just the art Bible, this was everything. Doom is about guns, demons, and speed. And so every choice they made, every feature they added, whatever it was, they would say, does this enhance guns, demons, or speed? And if someone said, well, none of those things, they would say, okay, we get rid of it. Great idea. Love that idea. We'll do it for a different video game. Everything, is about these 3 pillars. And again, I really appreciated that. When I heard that story, I was like, oh, that's awesome. I have to tell a big crowd of people at LightBox Expo sometime this. So in this particular, oh, actually, here, I'll go back just for a second. I'm not going to go through all of this. Well, actually, here, I'll read through it. I think we have time to quickly go through it at least the summary portion of it. So in the summary here, I just do a quick text summary of sort of what is the desert planet and the society here. So Ink takes place in a desert planet that was at one time completely covered in water. Humans crash landed on the planet in a generation ship, and after wandering the land, came across an enormous structure in the sand, which became known as the Citadel. So surrounding the Citadel, a supply of life-giving water. And so encircling the water, the people built their city, the Oasis, which was designed to protect its inhabitants from outsiders and keep the water flowing to its residents. A vast wall was constructed with a few heavily guarded gates, and 3 towers inside the walls, all of which were at the corner, one of each of the Citadel. So immediately within the walls were acres and acres of farmland, enough to grow the food for the inhabitants of the walled city needed to survive. Reinforced aqueducts piped water to the farmlands with guards posted at each spigot to enforce the city's strict water regulations. The city's core of merchants, workshops, and residents formed a tight ring around the citadel, and the tower guards kept an eye on the citizens as much as scouting for any approaching nomads. Rules were strict, punishments were swift, and a rift between the elites and the townsfolk had grown to such a point that the heroes of our story arrived, and many within the walls were as ready for change as those living in the wastelands. So that gives you the basic summary of sort of what is going on here in the story leading up to this point. And here's, for example, some of the objects. So the Citadel. The Citadel is this big, honking alien thing. No one has any clue what it is, which was sitting in the desert, but they discovered it had a lot of water around it. And there's no water in the desert. So they're like, we're going to set up our city here. And then you see the Oasis and the towers. This image was by another from Chris Stosky. Then there's the wall surrounding, which is a painting I worked on. The farmland around. Also, just to note, some of the paintings in the final book, in fact, a number of them were actually many people worked on them. So, for example, in the farmland painting, I did the majority of the painting, but then the human characters were done by two other artists, Christina and Bill Zahn. So it was really quite a group effort, even amongst specific illustrations. And then the desert wastelands. So the wastelands are around the city, and there are nomads that wander around it that want to get in the city, but they, of course, the people in the city want to keep them out so they can protect their water. Included in the summary, also great, are maps. So this is just a real simple map of what the oasis looks like. If this were Lord of the Rings, you'd want to have the picture, the Middle Earth at the very beginning of the Lord of the Rings books, or the Hobbit, one of those in there. A few other details, the gates through the wall, water gardens, painted by a number of awesome artists. And then I'm not going to get too much into this because we don't have time, but there's a whole about section in here. And the about section is split up into all these key things about these people. So what are their culture? What's their history? Government type, religion, military, language, character biology. I know these things might sound like more of a story Bible, but they're really not. Like, even though these aren't images, these are fundamental to then all the images which end up in the art Bible itself, really to understand who these people are and what it is they're doing. What level of technology do they have? Like in this group, all of the stuff that they made their city with are pieces of their generation ship that crash landed. So that's why you have sort of that high-tech scrap idea. It's that everything is built out of the scrap bits and pieces they were able to grab from the generation ship. This is information about their economy, energy sources, education. One of the concept artists, when I sat down with him before starting on this, before the art Bible was finished, this was stuff he was asking me. He's like, if I'm going to make concept for this, I want to make sure it fits within your vision of what this project is. And he asked me a bunch of these questions, and thank goodness I had some answers. And the ones that he didn't have, I was like, I hadn't thought about that. And I'm like, well, what do you think? And again, collaboration. It's about getting all the people together to figure this stuff out. Yeah, I like the last one. Cinema, none. There's no movies for these people because they have none. But who knows? Your particular project might have it. Then a bit of a historical timeline. Again, won't go through this, but you get the idea. It starts off with their landing in the desert, the fight with the nomads, which led to a whole lot of people leaving, and then when the story actually begins for our particular story, which is the story of ink. So even if you remove everything in an art Bible with concept art, I like kind of seeing at the very beginning some of the original reference that really kind of spoke to what the art Bible is. So again, you'll see a lot of stuff later on that would have been real world concept and then taken away. But I like just seeing sort of some of the original bits at the beginning, like here. So for example, we did a reference trip, went to Utah and took all of these photographs and got these, like, see that crazy thing, like it looks like a real thin tower and a big block on top? That's a real place. That's Goblins. It looks alien, but it's totally not. It's on our planet. It's in Utah. It's weird. Like, you feel like that thing's going to land on your head. And so when it came to the Utah trip, I was looking for stuff that, again, felt recognizable, and it is recognizable, but it felt a little bit alien. And then color palette. So for the people, rather than the standard, okay, I'm in the desert, so everyone's going to wear long robes, sort of the Lawrence of Arabia thing, I decided instead to go for the poncho as kind of a thing. I'm better at environments than I am at characters, which is why a lot of the character work was done by other people for the particular project. But I thought it was just like something a little bit different that would also allow for some interesting patterns and whatnot. And again, just not, something people recognized, but wasn't something that was very standard. Some furniture. I threw some furniture in here. And also, since the planet is a desert now, but originally was covered in water, the idea was that instead of like a cactus in the desert, we were going to have this giant coral. Again, giving it hopefully a little bit of a distinctive style. So here's some photos of real coral. And speaking of water, I'm going to quickly drink some water. So then it's called The Story of Ink because it's a story about a man and his robot. And the man's name is Landis, and the robot's name is Ink. So here is some reference I got for the robot that was going to be in the book. And it's a welding robot, and so I took a reference from all sorts of stuff, whether it was giant construction equipment, actually, welding helmets, an actual welder, that sort of thing. And we'll see more of this as we go through. As far as the city, lots of spare parts. So I got some photographs of giant boats that were ripped apart. Markets, sort of in this case, Middle Eastern locations, because it was meant to be sort of a desert style. Some interiors for some of the buildings themselves of the oasis. So after the reference, then I immediately go to shape language. And so the main shape language of the people of the Oasis is the chamfered triangle. And this is the footprint for the alien artifact, the Citadel, which sits at the heart of their settlement. And since the people of the Oasis consider the Citadel as kind of sort of like a god because it gives them, water, its shape has been incorporated into much of the people's architecture, clothing patterns, furniture, etc., as a way of sort of giving thanks. So as a simple rule, if you incorporate the shape language of the Citadel with the scavenged broken parts of the crashed generation ship, you have most of the people of the Oasis's design aesthetic. And so here's some examples of the Citadel you can see, and then the core shapes itself. So just as a little aside here, shape language is one of my personal favorite ways going about designing stuff. Once you come up with the shape language, so many other things fall together. And so I want to give you some other examples of shape language. Take a real short detour here. So this is Lord of the Rings. The movie, Lord of the Rings. And this is all stuff, actually here, can somebody guess which race all these things came from? Okay, and the reason it's the dwarfs is because if you look at a dwarf, first of all, they are kind of short and stout. They have hair which is going down long. They kind of look like a gemstone. They are digging for gemstones, and so everything about them is about that gemstone shape, whether it's their architecture, whether it's the rings they have, whether it's the axes they have. They did a spectacular design in that film of just coming up with a consistent way so that if you saw anything from any of these different races in Middle-earth, you knew what you were looking at. So this is a little bit from Up. So this is more about shape language in reference to not like defining an IP, but shape language to specific characters, but same idea. So Carl was a square, and he was a square because he was very rigid and, he followed the rules and he was a little bit grumpy kind of thing. Whereas Eleanor, his wife who passed away, she was round, she was organic, she was, somebody who, really, full of heart. Lewis, the little boy, he was basically an egg shape. The dog was kind of the inverse egg shapes, kind of like a tear. And the bird was basically triangles and sticks. And that sort of design philosophy worked in a lot of the stuff when it came to all those characters. And that was really fun to see at the very beginning of the project, that sort of stuff coming through. So one last example. A friend of mine had a book that he is still working on and hoping to work on, which is a compilation book of a bunch of basically sort of like Baroque, but at the same time injecting various sci-fi elements to it. And if you don't know the Baroque is an artist movement. It's got a lot of flowery but very symmetrical designs to it, very different from Art Nouveau, which is also flowery but is much more organic and non-symmetrical. And I really, while I hadn't done a lot of that, I really loved like the original Dune from 1984. It had a lot of that sort of design in it. Also, Juan Jimenez, amazing artist, did the Metabaron series, if you've ever seen that. And that stuff was really cool. So I'm like, oh, cool. I would love to do a part of this project. And so beyond the purely Baroque, I decided to also incorporate some elements of other art movements. So I took a little Art Deco, which is another movement you can look up, a little touch of Southeast Asian architecture, places like Thailand and Myanmar, and it provided me some design elements. So for example, lots of gold in the architecture, ornate detail around the edges, spires, and everything feeling very vertical. And then this is the painting that I ended up giving him, incorporating all of those different elements together. So as far as this goes, I could talk about the painting itself, and instead I'm going to talk about the shape language that inspired the various parts of this painting. And so the core shapes that I ended up picking, rather than just for the Oasis, picking that one chamfered triangle, I went for the star, the pill, the spindle, the flower, and ribs. And one of the reasons I took more than one or a number of them is because it is being kind of Baroque. There is lots of different kinds of detail, but I felt that these different shapes kind of work together nicely. And we'll start with the star. So the star is the most important. And frequently when you're creating a species, you'd write a backstory and then find a shape that solidifies that backstory. But in this case, I hadn't worked out an entire backstory yet, which gave me a chance to make the art and have it kind of influence the story. So I decided that while the alien planet has a sun at about the same distance as our own, they also had a neighboring star system that's far closer than our own star system, and so they'd have this rather large star in the sky, which is why a lot of stuff has the star in their particular aesthetic. And so this was a great example of art solidifying the story, which then solidified the art. And this happens a lot. Like on Star Wars, for example, there's a lot of times where George Lucas will just give the most random of things. Somebody would then make a piece of art and he'd go, I love that. And then he would actually write the story based on that little moment or that little thing that the person did. So sometimes it's always about the story, but if the story hasn't been written yet, there's a chance where you as an artist can inject some of that story, which I think is really a lot of fun to do. And then the second most important shape I decided was the flower, and part of that was because being a Baroque, you have to have some sort of flowery or something that looks like a flower in there. But that also affected the story because it's like, okay, if they have the flower, then this can't happen on a desert planet or a planet made of jello or something stupid like that because it makes no sense. If they have a flower as part of their symbology, then there must be flowers on the surface. So therefore, that immediately tells me a bunch of stuff about what is actually on the surface. If there must be forests and other sorts of things. So again, it's about figuring out how the story connects with the shape language, and then the shape language affects it back and forth. More patterns. Some of these patterns, again, feel very, they have some Art Deco elements and some Baroque elements, but they incorporate all of those different things inside. Symbols, same deal, the star, or some more flowery sort of symbols. And by the way, I always split it up into patterns is something that gets repeated, and symbols or a logo is something that appears only once. That's just the way I like splitting up my stuff. Typography. I decided, okay, well, if there's going to be flowers, there's probably vines, and so I decided to go for more of a vine aesthetic for their particular typography that would appear in various spots. And this was not a linear process. So, it's like you come up with the basic story, got a lot of reference, then I started doing a rough painting, then once it got to a certain point, I figured out what the shape language was, and then once that stuff happened, I went back and I revised the painting, and I started removing stuff that didn't fit within that shape language and adding more stuff that did fit within that shape language to solidify things. So again, it's not a linear thing. It's lots of back and forth. And so again, the final painting, and you can see here's just a lot of the different elements appearing, whether it be symbols, whether it be patterns, in all the different things. Even like, up here, you can see, even in the part you barely see, there's that star pattern being repeated over and over again. So anyway, a little aside, but again, I love the shape language thing. Hopefully some of you dig it too. I'll now get back to the ink stuff. And then here you see, very similar to the other one, it's like patterns. Okay, so many of the patterns, which you'll see later on various things, they come from the Citadel itself. So they saw that pattern on the Citadel, and so they're like, hey, I'm going to put it on my clothing, or I'm going to put it on the wall of my house. And then some of the patterns are more organic, and those organic patterns, instead of coming from the Citadel, come from, some of the giant coral that's around them and stuff like that. And then various type and symbols. I didn't need actual typography for the book, so instead I just forgot about doing an alphabet. But I did pull various symbols that were taken from the style of the Citadel and whatnot. So next, moving on to color scheme. And, color scheme itself, that could be easily a 1-hour talk. So I will not get into it, but mostly desert colors. As far as the colors go, and these colors aren't to be slaved over. These are things that are a starting spot, and then other colors, of course, can come in there, accidental colors. I like doing, as well as the 3 pillar keywords, I like doing more element keywords, which is just a little bit more specific, like what are the key things that really reflect what's going on. In this area, I then do an elements thing where I take concept art and I sort of take each one of the keywords and I illustrate it. So, what do I mean by banners? There's a banner. What do I mean by a tent, a rusty pipe? A headscarf, rock pillars, that sort of thing. So just getting a little bit more specific. And then getting one level even more specific under elements is elements in context. So it's like, okay, well, let's take one of these pieces of concept. And again, this one was done by Chris Dosky. And then where are all of those keywords in there? So look at, we have the sun glare, we have the distance haze, we have the cloth sun shields. For example, in this one, I didn't come up with the idea of the cloth sun shields. That was Chris that came up with that, and I loved it so much I then incorporated it into the art Bible itself. This is one of my paintings, and again, seeing a bunch of the stuff. So this is at the wall. You got the sun glare, banners, rusty pipes, spare parts, the dust storms, our 2 main characters, down at the bottom by this thing with epic scale. A more close-up painting, illustration, which is in the final book. You can see some of the weird rock formations that our 2 main characters are hiding under. Glass tubes, they have a little water condenser because they're at this point, they're nomads. They're walking outside of the city. They're not yet in the city, and so you have some of those elements in there, like trying to get water really badly. And moving on from there, materials. Especially if you're working on a big project, like in a film, for example, you'll have artists whose main job is just to do materials, or people who might do modeling and materials. So this can remain, if you want, you can replace it with concept, but otherwise you can also just use real materials from real reference. So you see lots of metal, a lot of brushed metal, lots of dirty stuff. You imagine metal being in the desert, and what does the desert do to metal? It bleaches it, it wears off, it has bits and pieces broken off it. Some of the rock, some of the cloth texture that you're going to get with the various characters. And so if you're working again on a film or a video game, there'll probably be people who will be developing this while you're working on the other stuff. And so this helps them sort of give a basic idea of what are the main things that they should be developing while other things are being developed. The homeworld, a little bit about the actual planet itself. The only one I'm going to mention specifically is gravity, being a little bit less than Earth, and there's a reason for that I'll speak about momentarily. Then getting some concept art of various geographical features, and one of the things I mentioned was giant coral, and that gets back to the weight thing. It's like, okay, so if you have giant coral, why does stuff grow so big? And the answer is, well, if you're going to make stuff grow big, one of the reasons it would grow big is if you had less gravity on the planet. So again, you're back and forth. You're like, okay, I want to have giant coral because giant coral is awesome. So how can I come up with in the story a way of justifying that? And then how does that affect the rest of the story? So for example, if gravity was really low, like, 0.2, then all the characters would be bouncing around. And if you don't have that, does that bother the audience? And so there's a lot of back and forth that goes through all these different elements to try to balance everything together. Okay, more geographical features. Some of these are my paintings showing some of the big weird rock formations. Painting by Jeremy Vickery up in the top right. Again, showing some of those weird like holes and different kinds of rocks you can imagine. Then getting into architecture, both interior and exterior. So some exterior stuff on the left. For the interior, it turned out that we never got a thing in the book where anyone was indoors. Everything ended up happening outdoors. There were parts originally that were indoors, but for time purposes and everything, they got cut from the story. And since they got cut from the story, I never bothered having a concept artist actually come up with concept of the interior of the thing. So this is the stuff you would use for just regular reference, and it would be replaced. In this case, it never got replaced. But if in the future there's an Ink 2, book, or somebody wants to pay me $1 billion to make Ink into a movie, all for that. The first thing is obviously you'd want to make some concept art of the interior of the buildings. Plants. So I mentioned before, it's all these giant decaying coral left over from when the planet was covered in water. Here's some concept of various kinds of coral shapes you can imagine. Animals. As far as the animals went, there's an amazing artist named Dominic Queck, he actually, when I mentioned I was making a book, he made some sort of comment on my Facebook page of like, oh, I can't wait to buy the book. And I'm like, oh crap, this guy's like awesome and he wants to buy my book. Maybe he'll work on my book. So I contacted him and he made a couple of creatures. The idea being that these are creatures that originally maybe started off more aquatic because again, it was a water planet, and then over time evolved into something more for the desert. And so you see some of those elements. I feel he did an amazing job of coming up with some of the creatures that would be in the story itself. Characters. So again, as being not as much of a character person, at least when it comes to human characters, I got concept artist Christina Davis to do a bunch of these, and so here are some examples of some of the character work that she came up with. And again, you'll see many of those patterns, shape language, referenced in these ones. These are farmers and merchants. And then you can see, like on the bottom parts of some of the priest and the religious acolyte, some of those patterns. The idea being that, okay, well, if they're like the priests and the priests, worship the citadel, they're more likely to have those patterns on them as a sign. Or another example is you can see the priest is holding a big thing of water. So again, water and having water and keeping water, very important story element. And so in this case, it's rather than that big, nasty thing that Landis and Ink were holding that's supposed to get water, she has this perfectly beautiful, ornate water container that she's holding. Same idea, it's about water, but it's just in a different form based on who the characters are. Props, furniture. I actually discovered I love making furniture. If you can make a piece of furniture that tells you everything you need to know about like an alien species or a group, I just love it. It's kind of fun because it's like a little design problem. It's like more complex than something small, but it's not as complex as an entire world. So in this case, again, remember generation ship. That crash landed, and so all the parts I figured of their furniture had elements of the citadel, while at the same time also having elements of what would the spare parts of the ship look like. Maybe the middle one there you can see sitting on a big spring that was used for something, or something in that vein. Random items and props that were used throughout the story, again giving some of that flavor of what like a random prop would be. Weapons, didn't have a lot of weapons in our particular thing. If you're doing Call of Duty, you'll have a ton of weapons for doing the art Bible for that. But in this case, I decided that the weapons that did exist, that the generation ship would not have had any weapons, but they did have stuff like power tools and welding torches and stuff like that, which is where Ink the Robot comes in. And so I decided any weapon that was created for the story would be based on sort of something that looks like a construction equipment that got modified in order to become a weapon. Robots, if your story has robots, and mine absolutely had a robot. This is Ink. And so this is a full 3D model that I made, and the idea was that in the story for illustrations, ink showed up in like 40 paintings, and rather than painting ink separately in 40 paintings, it made more sense to make a 3D model, pose, paint over top for all of those illustrations. Other things, if a particular character or creature only showed up in one illustration or two illustrations, it's faster just to hand paint that in 2D. So it was all about choosing the medium for what you wanted to do. But you can see in here some of the elements that made, like welder, right? You have that little flip top thing on its head. You got the big googly eyes, which has a little that Iron Giant Wall-E kind of feel to it. You have the scrapes all over the body, sort of like an industrial piece of construction equipment. And here are some of the other designs that sort of led up to the final design of Ink. And if, again, I were to do a sequel of this, I'd probably start with some of these designs, maybe change their color a little bit, and use these as other robots in the same universe. So vehicles, not a lot of vehicles in this one. This was a vehicle that Chris Dosky came up with, which I thought was kind of cool. But if you are doing, again, a different IP, you'd probably have a lot of vehicles in there. Other departments, again, if you're working on a film project or a video game project, there's usually a lighting department that does lighting. So giving them some ideas of what the basic lighting in the story is going to be, and certainly on this planet, is kind of a good idea. There's an effects department usually that makes stuff like explosions and water. No water for this story, but you get the idea. So these ones are mostly just reference photos with a few photos from the story itself showing off what kinds of different explosions and the welding sparks and dust storms and that kind of thing would look like. So that gives the effects people a chance to go and do some stuff. And then that is this particular art Bible. And I wanted to talk about, just briefly, these are the people that contributed to this particular art Bible. There's more than that that worked on the project. But for this particular group, it was myself, Bill Zahn, Stefan Bugaj, Dominic Queck, Chris Dosky, Jeremy Vickery, and Christina Davis. And I think we're just perfect here on time. We'll have time for some Q&A. I just wanted to say that one of the other things about an art Bible is I'm showing here an example of how to format an art Bible, and I've sort of taken the best parts of the different art Bibles that I've either contributed to or seen made and put it together, but that doesn't mean that my way of doing it is the right way. The most important thing is an art Bible is about communicating with people, usually the people you're working with. And if you listen to them, the people you're working with will tell you what they need in order to make the very, very best work. So you need to adapt your art Bible style to not only the particular needs of the project, but also to the people involved. The purpose of the art Bible, again, is communication to a team. So take the advice of the team, and if they ask for more details or less details in an area or some other way of formatting it, it's all about making sure that they can do their job at 100%. And you, as the art director, should be prepared to make changes in order to fulfill the main purpose of the Bible, which is as a communication tool. So all is very important to think about. And so this is the art Bible itself, really small, all the different pieces of it. And I know many of you, if not every single one of you, has a cell phone. So if you want a quick picture of this, but this one is the other one. So this is all the stuff that I'm placed in the art Bible itself. All the different sections. Again, not everyone, depending on what project you're doing, you might only have some of these. You might have more than these. It all depends on what the project is itself. But if you start off with this and replace it with your own stuff, the whole purpose of this talk is not to show this art Bible. The purpose of this talk is you yourselves are going to want to create your own art Bibles for your own projects. And when you do that, this gives you a starting spot. So you can take this format, put your own work into the format, decide that it sucks, change it, but at least you have somewhere to start, You don't start off with something that's blank and then it's all like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing, or it's just so daunting, I don't want to do it. This is like when you're trying to make a painting and you want to have just something on the canvas to start from, which you can then refine. For me personally, I have like one of the strongest fears of the blank canvas you can possibly imagine. And in fact, for the longest time, I would not do work, specifically drawing, because I was afraid. Like a lot of people, when they do drawings, especially if they have sketchbooks, I do not have sketchbooks because I'm afraid before every drawing that I'm going to make something that looks like crap, and then the sketchbook is ruined, everything else I did in there. So everything that I sketch, I have a little thing of separate paper. Like I used to sketch on copy paper because the idea is if I make something that looks bad on copy paper, I shred it. No one ever has to know that I made it. And so same thing here, it's like get a format together so that you have something that gives you the basics of what you need, and then, take your own style and define it from there. And that is it. So thank you so much.